Welcome everyone. I'm Sabrina Teller. I'm a partner at Remy Moose Manley. My firm practices CEQA and housing law. But I'm not going to give any of my opinions today. We're here with four very esteemed panelists. I'll do their introductions here right now. On my immediate right is Luis Mirante. He's Vice President of Public Policy for the Bay Area Council and has worked on housing policy at the state, regional, and local levels since 2017. He's also on the boards of CA Coalition, an ADU trade association, and the California Housing Defense Fund, which enforces Housing Accountability Act cases across the state. To his right is Jennifer Ganata. She's Communities for Better Environments Legal Department Co-Director. She's worked for CBE in various capacities, including being a youth organizer, legal fellow, and senior staff attorney. In addition to work on environmental justice issues, Jennifer has experience in doing housing justice and tenant rights work in Los Angeles. She has a deep interest in connecting her passion for environmental justice and housing justice to ensure frontline communities have a right to healthy and affordable housing. To Jennifer's right is Winter King. She's a partner at Shute Mahali and Weinberger LLP, where she represents community groups, environmental organizations, public agencies, and Indian tribes on a range of environmental and land use matters. She's represented both petitioners and lead agencies in CEQA cases and advises public agencies as well as environmental organizations on housing law issues. And then last but not least, on the far right, Valerie Feldman is an attorney with the Public Interest Law Project. Her work on housing and land use issues primarily focuses on housing elements, density bonus law, and other laws to facilitate affordable housing production, as well as fair housing enforcement. So I feel like we're so lucky to have such an expert and diverse set of perspectives on this panel, so we'll just jump right in. We've structured this as a roundtable discussion rather than individual presentations, and so we plan to take a couple of breaks periodically to allow the audience to ask questions so you don't have to hold your questions for an hour and a half, but we'll also take some time at the end for questions. So first off, I don't want to assume everyone in the audience has a deep knowledge of housing law and CEQA already, so I'll ask Val to start us off with a brief overview of the Housing Accountability Act, and then Winter's going to briefly summarize for us, to the extent possible, the overview of CEQA and what that requires.
So, and a brief is not easy with these laws, as Sabrina just said. So
we have an hour and 45 minutes, so don't have to be brief. It's okay.
Until 2017, this is the way I would describe the Housing Accountability Act. It was a little litigated, like often not litigated, statute that required developments that included affordable housing, or for emergency shelters, or for farm worker housing. It prescribed or limited the opportunities for jurisdictions to deny this type of housing unless the following conditions were met. The jurisdiction had met or exceeded its RENA requirements, so that's related to housing element law, a requirement that you have a certain need for different income levels, for a housing projection per period of time. Very unusual for any jurisdiction to meet or exceed their RENA in every income category. The other grounds for denial was that there would be a specific finding that the project would have a specific adverse impact on public health or safety, and that had to be, objectively found with quantifiable evidence. The denial would be necessary in order to comply with federal or state law. The development that was proposed was primarily on agricultural land, right? These were all grounds for denying a project that included affordability or for farm workers or shelter. And the last was whether the development was inconsistent with both the zoning and general plan land use designations. And this is the area that's gotten a lot of attention in the last so many years, because if you do not have a legally sufficient housing element, right, one that has been found in compliance by the State Department of Housing and Community Development, you cannot make a finding that the development is inconsistent with the general plan or zoning. Now, I say it was not often litigated because I think there are various reasons. The one that I'm most familiar with is that most nonprofit affordable housing developers that are facing a lot of opposition to their project, and maybe had grounds to say that the city was relying on reasons outside of the ones I just named to deny a project, often do not want to sue the jurisdiction where they're trying to build. And they were the only party that could bring suit. So one of the initial changes to Housing Accountability Act was to expand the parties who could bring a lawsuit challenging the denial of an affordable housing development, farm worker housing, or an emergency shelter. So somebody who would be eligible to live in that type of housing could also bring suit that may not have the same. Now there's another component to the Housing Accountability Act for all types of housing development, not just unit projects that include affordable housing or are intended for farm workers or for emergency shelters. And in those situations, the denial of a project also needs to be supported either by objective finding that there are going to be adverse impacts on health and safety, or that the project is inconsistent with the general plan, zoning, objective design standards. So it limits the ability for jurisdictions to deny housing developments even when there is not the affordable component or is not intended for farm workers or to facilitate the construction of emergency shelters. I thought that was about the limits of where I should go into in the detail. There have been, I think since 2017, something like 10 amendments to this law. So we're all still learning how those apply and how they work out. When I first became an attorney, it was still referred to as the Anti-NIMBY Act, which was not appreciated by many, and so the name was officially changed to the Housing Accountability Act, but you'll still meet attorneys who refer to it as the Anti-NIMBY Act, and so if you hear that, that is just what they're referring to.
Thank you, Valerie.
Great, now as a segue, I'll just say you didn't hear Valerie talking about CEQA because the Housing Accountability Act, until very recently, the only thing it said about CEQA was CEQA still applies. So the Housing Accountability Act, both previously and currently, doesn't have built into it an exemption from CEQA. CEQA is its own, and I see a lot of familiar faces who I know a lot about CEQA, and also people who were maybe at the last panel in this room where there was already a brief overview of what CEQA is. But the California Environmental Quality Act basically requires public agencies to consider and analyze and mitigate impacts of discretionary projects that they are considering approving or undertaking. And for our discussion today, that discretionary project is important because a lot of the new housing laws have required local governments to approve projects ministerially. So no discretion involved, and that is one way of basically saying CEQA doesn't apply. If you're approving something ministerially, sort of by its definition, CEQA doesn't apply. So that's writ large what CEQA does. Of course, there are many levels to the process for CEQA. Once you determine that a public agency is going to be approving a discretionary project that could impact the environment, then you look at what level of analysis needs to happen. The last panel covered pretty extensively that there's a whole range of exemptions in CEQA that are built in, both in the statute and in the regulations, which are called the CEQA guidelines. If the project isn't exempt, then the lead agency has to consider what level of review, if all of the potential environmental impacts could be mitigated to a less than significant level. The lead agency would typically prepare something called a negative declaration or a mitigated negative declaration, which is a more abbreviated environmental review. And if not, then something called an EIR, an environmental impact report, is required, and that's the most exhaustive level of environmental review. And generally, I mean, in addition to the process that CEQA provides, there is a substantive component where public agencies may not approve a project that has significant impacts on the environment unless they've adopted all feasible mitigation measures and or alternatives. So this is why, I don't know if any of you do legal work as well, but CEQA is way better. From an environmental perspective, there's actually some teeth to it in terms of that requirement. So that's the thumbnail sketch.
Excellent job. Thank you, Winter. So the first topic I want the panel to discuss is, as most of everybody is aware, I think the legislature has focused in recent years on facilitating housing approvals, passing what seems like an increasing number of housing-related bills each consecutive year, more and more. What does that trend look like from each of your perspectives? Are we getting more effective at balancing housing production and environmental protection, or is the overall result tilting too far in one direction or the other, or can we just not tell yet what the trend is? Who wants to start?
Is this working? You can hear me? Great. My name is Luis Morante. I work for the Bay Area Council, which I think, as Kip would put it, is one of the sort of low-bar anti-CEQA advocacy organizations. I am by day a lobbyist. I mostly observe the legislature and will often recommend changes that they make. And since 2017, I've worked on various housing-related bills, including several that have affected CEQA. I'm not a lawyer by training. Actually, in fact, I'm so bad with the law that Ryan back there quit working for me and went to school at UC Davis Law. So don't take everything I say for granted. But I am very interested in making sure that the legislature is making progress on the state's housing goals. As many of you know, especially those who rent, housing is increasingly unaffordable in California. The median home value in California is now about $850,000 for the average home in California. That's up substantially from where it was in the 1970s. I just finished a book written in 1978 about the environmental regulations and how they affected housing at the time. And I had to reread the first line of the book because it said that housing had reached the unimaginably high level of $50,000, and I thought it had said $500,000, and I was like, that seems a little high for the 70s, but it's unthinkably low by our standards. Adjusted for inflation, that'd be about $270,000. I take actually while I've worked on many of the laws that the legislature has passed, I've taken a pretty negative view of their effect. The housing market in California is today anemic. In large part, that's because of government policy. I would be remiss, though, if I didn't mention that was also interest rates. The city of San Francisco, I think the data is going to be finalized soon, but the city of San Francisco this year probably permitted about 500 homes, not 500 housing projects, but 500 homes, far short of what it needs. If it was approving affordable housing at the current rate for all of the housing that the state says it needs for its affordable sector, it would take about 270 years to build just this 8-year period's need for affordable housing. And the reason I think that the legislature, while they are taking increasingly ambitious steps that I applaud on housing, is not doing enough, or that the trend is bad, is because that's what the data tells me about housing production and housing starts. The state of California produces, in a good year, about 110,000 homes. That's slightly up from earlier in the post-recession era, like 2010, 2011, where the state was averaging about 90 to 100,000 homes. But what is hidden in that data is that about 30,000 to 20 to 30,000. This year it's probably going to be 25,000 of the homes that we are producing today are ADUs, accessory dwelling units, which are great. Ryan and I have worked on many of the bills, now laws, that affect ADUs. I'm very proud of them. Those laws exempt ADUs from CEQA. We can talk more about that. But the fact that we're building 25,000 ADUs, up from about 200 ADUs in 2016, hides the fact that the multifamily and single-family production sectors of the state have steadily declined, even since the 2015-2016 era. So if we're thinking about what we normally think about as homes, we're actually doing way worse. To put that in context, I am traditionally of the opinion, although this is a debatable one, that the state should be producing about 300,000 homes per year. If we wanted to talk more ambitiously about our climate goals, we would be producing probably many more hundreds of thousands than that. We currently are increasing the percentage of homes that we're building in high-risk environments like wildfire environments. We're reducing the number of homes as a percentage of homes that are being built next to transit. And if we wanted to have a conversation about really shifting California, not just to accommodate for the people who are already here, but shifting California into a world where everybody's able to walk to the grocery store or what have you, we'd have to be producing millions of homes per year. And that is way further from, I think, where even the ambition of any legislator is today. So I'm actually, I would be remiss if I didn't say that I really applaud the political risks that legislators are taking to pass these laws, but they fall far short of what the numbers tell us is needed to actually motivate the housing production that will calm housing prices and rents in the state.
Hi. So as Sabrina mentioned, my name is Jennifer Ganata. I just became co-director for the legal team this week, so that's why I was senior staff attorney, and now I'm not. So Communities for a Better Environment is an environmental justice organization that has offices both in Southern California and Northern California. I think Jonathan, if you were in this panel before, Jonathan, who is representing the California Environmental Quality Alliance, CBE was a founding member of that alliance. So there are 10 organizations statewide that are doing environmental justice work and varying in that type of work. And there are a few of us that are focusing really on housing and where housing and environmental justice intersect. So in the last couple of years, so I started off my work as an environmental justice organizer. And it was in the middle of my career that I ended up doing housing. So I was doing eviction defense work and seeing what was going on in Los Angeles. And then I moved on to doing like land use work. And this is where I started to see CEQA and housing come up in Los Angeles, in downtown Los Angeles and Skid Row. And I remember at the time was like, why are people not having these conversations together? As somebody who was an organizer and who also was like in the space of doing tenants' rights work at the time and talking to tenants' rights organizers, a lot of the conversation about development wasn't trickling down to frontline groups or groups that were deeply affected. Nor were we parsing that out. So when I came back to CBE, what I saw in Southeast LA was a lot of our members are mostly tenants. Southeast LA is about 73% tenant. And so that means a lot of people don't own the land. And we started to see projects kind of come in, but there was no discussion as to what those projects were and how those projects were going to be built. And in the same time, there's a backdrop of we are still in the middle of doing the Exide cleanup. We are still dealing with all the pollution that is coming from nearby Vernon or even the freeways, truck traffic, et cetera. And I started to realize these conversations are not actually happening like with environmental justice communities. And so there was a silo between housing justice and environmental justice. I was lucky to actually have a lot of connections still in the housing justice world. So I think like I was starting to piece together with my former colleagues and my current colleagues, like what can we do today? And so when you ask the question about bills and where are bills going, I think the attack on CEQA from the side that says that we need more units, it doesn't really look into what is the root cause of why we don't have affordable housing or why we don't have enough housing. And I think that's the frustration that a lot of EJ groups are having is because, yes, we want deeply affordable housing and we want healthy housing and we don't think that you have to sacrifice one or the other and there needs to be a way forward. And I think that's sort of where I feel like last year I spent a lot of time talking to the legislature and trying to explain why we were fighting for setbacks from oil wells and active oil wells, why we were fighting for setbacks still from freeways. And those conversations that I felt like we had 10 years ago when I was an organizer, they were coming up again. Like people were saying, well, we're gonna have an electric vehicle so we can build right up against the freeway, et cetera. Like, and to me, it was like my mind was blown because at the end of the day, for frontline communities, most of us are not we don't own the land, so we're not part of those conversations. And so I think when we are talking about developers and what are developers doing, and then you're streamlining things and not actually having notice requirements and everything fits into an exemption, I think that is the danger to environmental justice communities that have fought really hard for deep democracy, to have fought for public notice and fought to have the conversation with lead agencies. And I think this kind of comes up too. So I met Val because we were actually doing a housing element lawsuit in Huntington Park. And I think when we were starting the case and we were looking at it, part of it is like to look at what the site inventory is in the community. And it was so hard to find anywhere to build because things were never remediated or things were on the EnviroStore. And those were things that just consistently came up. Like you have a RENA number you need to hit, but at the same time, right now, there is nowhere safe to build. So then you have communities who need deeply affordable housing that may not get it. And, what might get built there, though, could be, high market rate housing. So that also is not what the community wanted, because the community wanted deeply affordable housing that fits between 20 to 30% AMI, and the things that we're getting are more privately owned, developed, and no one's going to see or have any of that oversight. And I think that for us, at least at CBE and how we're talking about housing, is like where are we still centering EJ communities? Like if CEQA, I think for folks who were here before, Kip was talking about, like, CEQA really is an environmental justice statute. It really does try to get that public notice and that information. And I think also, like, what's been happening with the bills is you start to hear language of people co-opting, I guess, basically the struggles that a lot of groups in SAHA have been doing. And that's been kind of why we've been at the forefront. We're like, no, these groups are not speaking for us. We're telling you what's on the ground. We have 10 organizations statewide. They have members. Between us, like, we have thousands of members. And this is how they feel, and this is what's going on. And a lot of them are not at policy tables and having those conversations. So I think that's kind of what I'm afraid of. And just like kind of one last thing, I do think it is shifting where we're deregulating the market for developers. I've recently just been rereading Mike Davis's book, Ecology of Fear, and in the 90s he was talking about this already. And so I think it really is, like, we really haven't learned from all the things that we've done in the past. I do think particularly, like, when we think of communities that are frontline communities by refineries or by metal recyclers, we have to think about those health impacts and what that means to put more housing there and not look at, like, what's going on there. And I think when I learned about CEQA as a law student, I remember learning that it was like, look before you leap. But now we're just leaping and we're not even looking what's about to happen.
Thank you. I think maybe my response will focus on like the evolution of some of the housing laws, since what I think of as like the OG SB 35 from 2017, which was, I think someone in the last panel was saying we maybe shouldn't call them streamlining bills, but was basically a bill that said, okay, we want this certain kind of housing. We want housing in areas that haven't been meeting their RENA obligations. We want it to include some affordables. So if you can put together a housing project that has these qualifications and is not in these sensitive environmental organizations, we're going to tell the local government that it has to approve it ministerially. So you can have one hearing, but you can only talk about certain things, very short timelines for processing the applications, and only apply these objective development standards. And so that was SB 35. And I think one thing that was interesting about that was, just so everyone knows, and I think until then, most of land use planning and project approvals was entirely handled at the local level, right? Like cities and counties, they have their own general plans, they have their zoning. There's some state, of course, oversight in terms of like general rules. You have to have a general plan, it has to have these certain elements. But it was mostly local governments just making up what they wanted the rules to be in their jurisdictions. And then most of that was not filled with objective standards, which objective standards, according to this new bill in 2017, meant that it had to be a standard that, well, the way I interpret it in my mind is, if I'm an applicant, I need to know without talking to any planner that my proposal is going to satisfy the standard. So you can imagine it's like height limits of 25 feet, like that's pretty clearly objective standard. Does it fit in with the surrounding community? No, I wouldn't know if a planner is going to say that my, stucco design fits in or whatever. So that original bill kind of, and there have been subsequent bills like it over time to kind of use that model, I think sort of highlighted that a disconnect between what the legislature thought was going on in planning departments and what was really going on. Like, that was a big shift to have to like process these applications and only do objective standards for local governments. And I think the idea was, and this is sort of in line with what others were saying about relying on existing environmental laws in order to protect the environment as opposed to CEQA with its processes and separate environmental review. The idea was, I can just imagine ahead of time all the things that might come up in any development project, and we'll have a checklist, and it'll be really great. And once you satisfy the checklist, then your project is approved. Well, I think we've all learned a lot since then, and when you actually go through this process, and again, my experience on this has actually mostly been with public agencies and planning departments trying to process them. And you have 30 days to review all the plans, 30 to 60 days, and you have to have your fire department review it. You're never going to catch every single thing. And you also, without having any CEQA review, maybe this is on a site where there used to be a dry cleaner. Well, too bad, so sad. That's not one of the disqualifying sort of characteristics under SB 35, unless, as Jonathan mentioned in the previous one, it's on a special list, which doesn't include everything. So I think in implementing this, there's been a real learning process of it's actually not that easy to anticipate every single issue that's going to come up, every environmental issue that's going to come up in reviewing a project. And so you'll see over time that in the subsequent bills, even in modifications to SB 35, in terms of, SB 35 originally only talked about, is this going to impact a historic structure? We had the Berkeley Shell Mound case, which that definition didn't really fit. And so the legislature has gone back and tweaked it a number of times, trying to respond to some of the, I think, what I would say are sort of holes or gaps in what SB 35 originally did. And there have been subsequent bills since then that have sort of adopted this model for streamlining, although really it's just making CEQA inapplicable because now the approvals are ministerial, that I think have sort of learned some lessons from that. And one of them, AB 2011 from 2022, also it included, so to the sort of dry cleaner point, included some requirements for doing some actual, testing and review to make sure that the site was actually safe prior to approval. And the other component to that, of course, is with this ministerial process, not a lot of opportunity for public input. And I think the environmental justice community has been really amazing at getting out there that this is not okay, that it's not okay that developments in infill sites or in urbanized areas, the communities don't get to even have any say or present any information. And so you'll see as the new bills come in that there's, I think, been more of an effort to include at least some opportunities for public input. How powerful those opportunities are compared to CEQA sort of remains to be seen. So I think it's been sort of a learning process and a sort of hopefully a little bit humbling to see, it's not actually that easy to identify ahead of time every single thing that might come up. And CEQA does serve a really important purpose to catch those things and provide additional review. And then the other point I'll just make is that the SB 35 model and this whole kind of will it, won't it apply question of CEQA is only like one bucket of the state housing laws. There are a number of other sort of types of state housing laws that have come up. You mentioned that the ADUs, which includes, because they're ministerially approved, also are not subject to CEQA, but general rules for local governments saying, hey, you used to get to control all of this, and now we're going to tell you, no, actually, you have to approve these types of things. You have to allow these types of uses. You have to allow residential even in commercial areas. There's also density bonus laws, which say, no matter what the local government says in terms of how many units you can have on this site, if you include affordable housing, senior housing, other types of housing, you can have greater densities, which one sort of side note observation is for the density bonus law, and I don't know if you'll agree with this, but one thing that I've noticed is that actually developers tend to use the density bonus law not even so much to get increased number of units, but more because there's an extra piece which says, and You also get a certain number of concessions from the local government if you meet the qualifications under the density bonus law. So query whether that law is actually serving the purpose of getting more units as opposed to kind of getting more exceptions from local development regulations. And then one other category I would just put in there is the like the SB 9, which is sort of the end of single-family residential zoning, allowing at least 2 and kind of up to 4 units on land that's designated just for single-family homes. Again, it's sort of a top-down planning law, so the state's coming down and saying, I don't care what you said, local government, about what you wanted in this area, you are going to have to allow additional residential there. And that was sort of recently expanded with another bill that required approval of kind of small subdivisions up to 10 units. So just wanted to put this all in the context of some of this housing law touches on CEQA, others kind of is on its own.
So I'll try to wrap this first question up with a pretty short answer, which is I think we don't know yet all of the impacts. I think from the perspective of someone who's worked to try to facilitate affordable housing production, some of the feedback and concerns that we've had in the last, how many years since 2017, in the last 7 years, is that there is a very, very strong kind of rallying call that all of this is necessary to address the housing shortages in California. And when we look back at the last, so I focus on housing elements, what's been produced due to housing element programs, the number of units that have been produced, and income levels. We have an affordable housing crisis in California. We don't have an overall housing crisis, meaning there are a surplus of units to meet above moderate income household needs. There is a significant shortfall in housing to meet lower income housing needs. That is due to a number of factors, funding being the primary one, in addition to sometimes design guidelines, sometimes CEQA requirements, sometimes others. So kind of when you're balancing from the perspective of the people that I work closely with, the balancing of pushing for by right approval or non-discretionary development is focused on the level of affordability, which right now in many of these laws is fairly low in order to be able to take advantage of them, which is not addressing for the, as we've seen so far, not addressing what we view as the real housing crisis, which is really the number of affordable units that are able to be constructed in any given year, any housing element planning period. And I would be remiss if I didn't also address the idea of not just facilitating that, the balance of the give and take between by right approvals to help facilitate housing production also needs to be focused on whether that increase in housing production is replacing existing affordable housing, has a chance of displacing existing tenants, and the balances we need to try to achieve in terms of considering environmental factors, making sure that review can be done, but also not inhibiting residential development, has to be focused primarily on those two things. One, increasing new affordable housing and not diminishing existing affordable housing. And the number of laws that have been enacted, for instance, the ADU laws have been seen as a way to, this will be an amazing way to address affordable housing because these units will be affordable, without any actual justification. We saw many jurisdictions during this housing element process. The Central Valley is still working on many of their housing elements, but for most jurisdictions, they should have adopted a legally compliant housing element by now, are focusing on ADUs as an answer to affordability without having real data to show that those units are being rented at affordable rents or even being rented at all. Since 2020, a lot more people are working from home. we don't know how many of those ADUs are going to be used for home offices as opposed for rental. And so without that evidence, it's hard to know if that, increase in number of ADUs is going to have any real impact on kind of affordability. So that's where I say, like, the verdict is still out. We have pushed in many jurisdictions for them to, just as one example, to monitor the affordability level of those ADUs, to take action. So it's an 8-year planning period for a housing element, to take action at the midway point if what you're seeing is that those units are not being rented or not being rented at affordable rates, then you need to figure out another way to accommodate your lower income RENA, right? And what that might be rezoning, might be something else, but you can't wait till year 7 in your planning period and say, oh, that didn't work out the way we thought it would. These ADUs actually are being rented at market rent or not being rented at all, and therefore we didn't address, our RENA. And not every jurisdiction relies heavily on ADUs, but for the many jurisdictions that do, they have to be able to show those affordability levels.
Thank you, Valerie. Next, let's talk about the tension between, let's continue on the vein of the potential tension between CEQA and the Housing Accountability Act. So, on the one hand, as we heard from Winter, CEQA requires review of nearly every single discretionary project that could have adverse impacts. Whereas on the other hand, the Housing Accountability Act regards construction of housing as presumptively good for the environment. More housing means, a positive in the way that law is structured. So how do we reconcile these seemingly competing philosophies, and can we avoid conflict between those two positions in your view? Jennifer, you want to start?
So I think, that is also like one of the things that for EJ groups we are trying to figure out how they, from my understanding, at least when I've read the Housing Accountability Act and previously, and I've read CEQA, they're not supposed to be inconsistent. I mean, it's similarly, just like general plans, like things need to be consistent. But then, this past legislative cycle, we have a bill, AB 1633, and there are a lot of things in it that I think a lot of EJ groups did have questions about, because I think we were analyzing it from the perspective of, did you work on the bill? Do you want to give a description of the bill?
And I'll try to do this in the most neutral possible tone because I was the lead lobbyist for this bill. AB 1633 amends the state's Housing Accountability Act. It establishes 2 main new protections for housing projects that allege that they've been denied. There's one for projects that are subject to an EIR or a mitigated MND or some other environmental determination under CEQA. And for there are 5 tests that a project proponent could have to prove to determine that the local government has unlawfully denied the project using a CEQA determination. The main one is that there, by a fair evidence standard, isn't information available to the local government that they shouldn't grant the environmental determination, and then one of the other tests is that the local government does not grant the environmental determination. Fair evidence is a pretty low standard, but it is not no standard. There are other standards that are used in the law. So I think that's sort of category number 1 of the HAA. One other thing to know about the HAA is that the penalties for violating the HAA are clear and decisive when it comes to project outcomes. A court can remand the case back to whatever the policymaking body was and say, we're telling you to do the opposite of what you did. And it can also establish that there's a $10,000 per unit denied fee on that local government that's then paid into an affordable housing fund at the state level and recycled for future projects. So that's kind of category 1 of what 1633 does. It does this, generally speaking, in infill areas. There's a long list of environmental criteria that one has to meet, some non-environmental criteria too, to be eligible for the protections of 1633 under the HAA, and those criteria apply to both of 1633's main pillars. The second pillar is what most attorneys think is the strongest in 1633, it says, and establishes two tests. It says that if the project is alleging that it is exempt from the California Environmental Quality Act under categorical exemptions or statutory ones, that and then there are two tests, and that there is substantial evidence in front of the decision-making body that they should grant that exemption, and then that they don't, and they're noticing requirements and so forth. Then there is a much higher penalty on local governments, not as a function of the HAA, but as a function of the evidentiary standards that a local government would have to meet to prove that it has not violated the HAA. The sort of bow around all of this, and is a piece that's quite controversial, and I'd actually be happy to get into the politics of why it's in the bill, because I think it's actually quite instructive about the trend in lawmaking generally, is that in situations where local governments make a decision about a housing project's environmental document pursuant to 1633, the courts are instructed to believe that that decision was made in good faith, unless there's clear and convincing evidence, I think is a standard, I may be wrong, someone might tell me, to the contrary. Like, for example, the local government is proved to have known about an environmental deficiency on the site or lied to the public about something related to the project. And in these situations, project opponents, people who are bringing a lawsuit, a successful CEQA lawsuit against the project, are not entitled to attorney's fees in almost every instance. And that's, up to the discretion of the court ultimately, but they're instructed that this is an exceptionally rare case where attorney's fees should be granted. That differs greatly from what project proponents generally believe about CEQA, in that it's project proponents in general, like developers, believe it's quite easy for project opponents to get attorney's fees. There are, for example, cases where there's a minor declaration error, or there's a noticing error, and it is an error in a CEQA case, but then a court is allowed under the current standards to say, well, because that error was found and this project opponent brought it successfully, we're awarding attorney's fees. So that means the opponent has to, the developer has to pay the attorney's fees for their party and the other successful party, which can be quite expensive. And I think many groups, including environmental justice groups, believe that not awarding the penalties under 1633 will have the effect of chilling anti-project lawsuits. And again, happy to get into why that's in the bill and the politics of all that.
So there's that. So I think when I'd say like in the through the Alliance, even though the Alliance never formally opposed it, the different member organizations were concerned. We were concerned about the attorney's fees portion, but I think what we were most concerned about was if you had a jurisdiction that doesn't have a lot of resources, what reason would you have to actually do any environmental review? So I know that when I was arguing, I think with some of your colleagues, talking about it, is I get what you're saying. It doesn't explicitly say it is trumping CEQA, but what it does, particularly for jurisdictions that have nothing and they don't want to fight with a developer, they're not going to probably err on the side of protecting the community. And for us, I was thinking about Huntington Park. Bella and I have had a lawsuit, and it's very hard to get it to the place where it was. The AG gets involved, and still it's very hard to get it to where we are in kind of how we've been implementing what we've worked on and getting a compliant housing element. But I was thinking about that, different projects that are coming into this area that might kind of, maybe it would have environmental review. What impetus would there be to have that environmental review if you had there's this other thing and maybe the jurisdiction will get sued? So that was my concern for environmental justice communities particularly. And I think that's what's hard for me to say okay, that's a good bill, because it does feel like you're trying to get around CEQA, but not actually saying on its face you're getting around CEQA, but in effect it will be that way. I don't know if folks.
Yeah, that was the AB 1633, this requirement of, kind of imposing a penalty if you ask for too much environmental review, did seem like kind of a new category of regulation that really, in my experience, is going to put a practical thumb on the scale of approving projects, and also, to use colloquial terms, it creeps me out a little bit because it seems like a mechanism to prohibit public agencies from getting information, which is really the whole point of CEQA. So that seemed to be a new foray. I think there's already a thumb on the scale in the sense of how, as a practical matter, if there is potential litigation involved for these projects, developers almost always indemnify public agencies that approve the project. So the public agency knows that if they approve a project and they get sued, they're not going to have any litigation costs because the developer is going to pay. Whereas if they deny a project, or if they otherwise side with a group that has identified some environmental concerns and the developer sues, then that they're on the hook. The environmental group's not going to indemnify the city for taking that stand. So I feel like it's kind of in that category of like a real practical thumb on the scale. So yeah, but I think going back to the original question, I would just say I kind of agree that I don't actually think that there has to be, first, I'm not sure that the Housing Accountability Act actually says all housing is good environmentally, and of course it applies to all housing, not just affordable housing. And so I think they have worked together. I mean, I don't think there needs to really be the conflict there, and CEQA does have a number of exemptions which were discussed in the last panel, particularly for infill development, affordable housing, agricultural housing development. So I guess I'm fighting the hypothetical a little bit in terms of going with that there is a conflict.
I think I would just second that. I think that my first response when I was invited to join the panel was, but Housing Accountability Act doesn't carve out like an exemption for CEQA, right? It still applies. So are we talking on a broader scale than just the Housing Accountability Act, and more about a move towards allowing more by right, non-discretionary approved projects in general, and not just under the Housing Accountability Act? Because and obviously I don't represent developers typically, and and certainly not market rate developers. So I cannot say like with an authority like what the view of kind of Housing Accountability Act having this broader impact in terms of non-discretionary approval. I don't see that from our perspective of working on issues of affordable housing. I see it as like that's an area where they've tried to reconcile the need for approval of these types of development without avoiding environmental review. So I would maybe hold it up as a good example as opposed to some of the other laws that have created these carve-outs or by right approval without substantial affordability requirements.
Thank you. So as a follow-on to that question, which we sort of went all over the place on that, but it was a good touching on a lot of different subjects. Among some quarters, there's a growing sentiment that we need to do more and more to facilitate infill housing development, particularly in urban and semi-urban settings, in order to reduce GHG emissions and air pollution caused by long regional commutes and development sprawl out in the hinterlands. So how do we balance a housing project's local impacts with the long-term impacts related to sprawl? Is there a way to accomplish both of those goals?
I'll give that first crack. I think that in rooms like this, there's often very little disagreement in theory that infill housing is something that the state needs to move forward its environmental vision. And so I actually kind of want to elide that more fundamental question for what I think is the most important question for rooms like this to answer. And it's actually more about the role of housing markets generally. Kip to me made a really interesting comment in the last panel where he said that it was fatuous to believe that deregulating a housing market was going to allow that market to self-correct. And to a certain extent, I actually kind of agree with that. But I think that's more of a statement of cultural politics than of what Kip believes about housing policy. And it's one about the role of market rate housing in general. There's been a lot of recent research on the differences in rates of homelessness between regions and between cities. There's a great book, it's quite short, that I would recommend to everybody called Homelessness is a Housing Problem, that came out in 2022, and it reviews the literature around interregional causes of homelessness, and then provides its own new research and what I think is very convincing evidence that the single most important variable for in America for predicting how high a region's housing or rather its homelessness rates is going to be the vacancy rate of housing. In regions with really high vacancy rates of housing, even ones with much higher rates of poverty or substance abuse or mental disorder, the rates of homelessness are much, much lower. For example, in Texas, where the housing market there produces hundreds of thousands of homes every year in an economy that's actually quite similar to the economy, especially of Southern California, reasonably good jobs, about 30 million people. They produce a lot of sprawl housing and so aren't limited by mountains in the same way that Southern California is. But in places like Texas, the homelessness rate is about 1/5, or depends on the year, but between 1/5 and 1/4 of the homelessness rate here in California. On paper, Texas has a much higher poverty rate when unadjusted for housing costs. It contributes far less funding to the production of affordable housing than we do on a per-person basis. It has far fewer tenant protections and anti-eviction defenses. All important pieces of the puzzle, not things that I'm trying to say California should repeal or not focus on, or there are lots of different levers we should pull. But the main controlling variable, in my mind, for why Texas has so much less homelessness than we do, is they produce a far greater number of market rate, what we might even call in this state luxury homes, than California does. And so to return to your question, I think the actual big fundamental problem that we need to answer as a state is whether or not we want more market rate housing in places like Berkeley or San Francisco or Los Angeles. That is a fundamental debate that we need to answer. There are protections we can wrap around that and should. State laws that I've worked on, for example, prevent things like the destruction of affordable housing, even naturally occurring affordable housing, without that housing's replacement. There are other things that we can do. Things like SB 35, for example, prevent the use of their streamlining on sites that have had tenants in the last 10 years. There are things we can do to mitigate problems like that. And these are actually conversations that we should continue. But the fundamental question that we as a group need to answer is market rate housing good for the environment when it's placed in dense urban areas and next to transit? I don't want to spend too much time on my response to that. I think you can probably guess what my response to is on that, and I'm happy to go over some of the evidence that I have for that response. But I think that's the important question that we as a group of people in the state really need to answer. And there's another last point that hopefully I'll remember by tomorrow. But I really like. Oh yes, this comes to mind in part because I was in a community meeting for a housing project in the community of Belvedere in the Bay Area this week. The project in question is 39 units, 12 of which are going to be affordable. It is Belvedere has an average home value, I believe, about $2.5 million, but you can look it up. It's a very wealthy community. This is the first apartment building that's been proposed in Belvedere in over 40 years. It is one of the wealthiest communities on the planet. It has one of the best health outcomes, one of the best school districts. It is within 15 minutes of downtown San Francisco via transit. It is an incredible place to grow up. I was, I was on Zoom, but I was in this meeting with 250 segregationists who were fighting this project via CEQA, trying to get that project denied, and it took moving heaven and earth to get that project moving forward. Some might say that's actually an example of CEQA working, and I actually commend the city and think this isn't the best example of CEQA abuse. But what it more importantly highlights is, for me, is what communities we want to be uplifting, and should there be communities that we actually want to turn down. I actually think, and this is again kind of a bigger 30,000-foot level, that if we can answer the first question that I've posed about market rate housing in a way that I think the literature suggests is the right way to answer it, the next question is there a way that we can streamline the production of housing, not just through CEQA or, and I can talk, I actually kind of think CEQA is low on my list of barriers to development, although developers tend to think it's very high on their list, and we can talk about why that is. but not just through CEQA, but through everything. You know, is there a way that we can streamline housing in places like Belvedere over the objection of these folks who are fighting tooth and nail with all the financial resources at their availability to block that housing? Is there a way that we can do that, de-elevate that community, while elevating communities in Southeast Los Angeles who don't have enough tools to fight projects that are harmful to their health? That, to me, is the second and probably most important public policy question to answer in the environmental law space in the next 10 years.
I don't have too much in response to this question because I think it's sort of more of an economics question, which is, and I don't represent developers, so I don't have a good handle on some of that. But I do just want to say this idea that, I mean, I think CEQA actually was very helpful in making people aware of the environmental impacts of sprawl developments. So I don't want to forget that as we're now, like, I feel like it's had a really longstanding institutional educational role. I mean, we had CEQA, there were a lot of fights over environmental impacts of greenfield developments. And then we had, of course, like SB 375, which was focused on, okay, we need to do better at planning and doing planning that's around transit and not and make it dense. So anyway, I just want to put in a plug that I think it actually helped a lot in the early days and continues to help on that front.
When I think about this question, I think back to a debate that occurred maybe 2 planning periods ago in housing element law, where you were looking at whether it was better to put like significant housing needs in places where transit already exists, or putting some of those housing needs, recognizing them in areas maybe seen as sprawl, but in suburban jurisdictions that maybe don't have the same type of transit possibilities. And the debate then was about, yes, it makes sense to have housing close to transit, but it also makes sense to have housing in areas that have high opportunities, that have, all of the things that was just described in terms of access to good education, access to job opportunities, access to better health outcomes. And so that balance and debate about where housing needs should be located, we can't only consider kind of the long-term effects of driving and the cost of commute, but it was wrong to maybe focus the argument in that way, where the argument could be, let's increase the resources to make transportation more available and recognize the need for housing in those communities. So meaning, don't avoid putting housing for people with lower income in suburban areas because of the increase. It would be bad to increase the amount of pollution that comes to requiring people to commute to jobs. But that's not the end of the inquiry. The end of the inquiry is, what can we do to increase transportation effectiveness and increase job opportunities where they wouldn't need to commute? The answer wasn't just not to put any housing in outlying areas and only to concentrate it in more urban places. Now, whether or not that actually comes to fruition, and there's funding and support for that, but the debate, I think, was too constrained because it made everybody feel like, oh, the only choices are either people have long commutes in cars that may be more polluting, or we put more housing in downtown areas or close to jobs, instead of what are all of the investments we could make to make access to higher resources areas possible and reduce transportation or air pollution.
I think what I'm hearing you say is more housing and transit everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was also sort of like looking at the communities that CBE works in, and I think it's easier to get land in those communities because they're so disinvested in. And currently, the like for instance in Southeast LA, there are going to be 3 new stops in Southeast LA, and kind of seeing how is that going to be impacting those communities. And I think the fear was that if we just continue to go on this trend, which I do think it is important to have better transportation, mass transportation. It's one of the things that I think that CEHA is trying to work on to make sure that we're doing that. But I think the concentration can also, and not thinking about the affordability levels too, can also lead to displacement. And I think that's also one of the things that we wanted to flag, that there are we do want to reduce greenhouse gases, but we also want to think about the equitable development principles. And I feel like that oftentimes is not really thought about.
Thank you. Now might be a good time to check in with the audience and see if anyone has any burning questions. Okay. You were first over there. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Chris. I'm a second-year law student here, and I've also been working with a nonprofit called the Environmental Action Committee of West Marin. And last year, we were working looking at SB 423, SB 35 as a bill of concern. And I have two different specific questions about these streamlining bills. First, is a lot of these bills which seek exemptions are claimed to be proponents of affordable housing. However, the definition of affordable housing in these bills can be different. And in SB 423, for example, I believe the requirement was only 10% of the development needed to be deed restricted, which it's amazing it's deed restricted, but one thing I'd like to pose to the panelists is what should affordable housing be defined as, and should it only be, is 10% too low to categorize the entire development project as affordable housing and be subject to and be allowed all these exemptions? And the second question I have, and I apologize, it's different, but EJ communities and disadvantaged communities already have a hard time as it is communicating with the office holders and especially private developers, their concerns. And a lot of these streamlining bills which seek to have objective standards, you can't really have an objective standard for what an EJ community would like without having a discussion with them. So how do you fit these objective standards to accommodate EJ community concerns next to height requirements or some other numbers? So that's something I'd like to pose to the panelists, both for and against these streamlining bills. How do we make this, how do we get those, boil down those EJ community concerns to a standardized, objective manner? Yeah, I apologize, those are two different questions.
Those are great questions. Thanks, Chris. Somebody want to talk about the sort of varying definitions of affordability?
So my answer to the first question is the affordability requirements are too low. That was a major concern when SB 35, for the groups that I work with, was initially passed, and the amendments made in this past year to that law. The idea of basically the trade-offs for allowing the exemptions to go forward for limited affordability was really problematic to a lot of groups and continues to be so. The second question is it's an excellent question in terms of how do you create these standards without input from the public? How do you create these? I think a lot of work by community organizers has been to alert people to kind of how the process already is, as opposed to changing what the process is, so that more people, right, so that you don't need excessive resources to be able to get people involved and make them aware of what's happening. It is and I am in no way an expert in this. My exposure, as the case that Jen has been talking about in Huntington Park, was my first real exposure to the requirements of an environmental justice element in every general plan. It's a new requirement. Jurisdictions are still navigating what it means, and kind of best practices, I think, are still being developed. But one of the components there is to facilitate public engagement. Right? So an EJ element should be focused on how do we engage the public, and if jurisdictions that are obligated to adopt an environmental justice element have not done so, or have not adopted one where it is clear what the programs and policies are that are intended to facilitate that discussion, that's one area of focus in terms of advocacy, I think, that is available. And hopefully, from my perspective, and I don't even know if I'm saying this on behalf of my organization or just myself, hopefully more robust, we will see more robust requirements for that environmental justice element component of the general plan moving forward in terms of, you know, when I talk about the history of a housing element, for better or for worse, the housing element contains a lot of requirements in the statute, but that is not the origin of the housing element. The housing element did not require a site-specific inventory with following categories to be assessed when the housing element was first enacted. Jurisdictions kind of went outside and said, oh yeah, we have sufficient land, this is good. And advocates said, well, how do we know that exists? And so I see, hopefully, kind of a similar trajectory for the environmental justice element, which is now that it's a requirement, people will see how easy or how hard it could be to actually fulfill its goals and purpose, and that will result in more specific requirements in order to like engage, open a process that makes it easier for people to be involved in.
Yeah, and I'm reminded when I gave my little overview of CEQA, I wanted to make clear to just really state that CEQA applies beyond just residential projects, right? It's all projects. So, in terms of EJ concerns, go ahead and utilize CEQA to its fullest extent for those warehouse projects and industrial and commercial and things like that. And then this is kind of a lame response to how to get in there with your community concerns for the streamlined projects, but because there's been this shift in focus from subjective design standards to objective ones, a lot of jurisdictions are actually kind of trying to convert, right? They're not just saying, oh, well, now we can only apply our setbacks and height limits. They're saying, ooh, how can I take this standard that where I used to say, does the look fit in with the community to, can I make it into something that's more concrete so we can continue to apply it? And so I would say to the extent any local government is going through that process, I mean, this is one that I think is tricky because it requires some technical expertise, and if you can frame your concerns in a way to say, we need to make sure that these things are addressed, and they're addressed in a way that is gonna be enforceable for all projects, even the streamlined ones, there might be some opportunities out there for that.
Do you have any thoughts, Jen?
I agree with Al.
Okay. I think you had a question as well.
Yeah, couple of statements and then a question to follow. So much of this controversy, if you will, or the friction is based on the question, what happens to the environment, what's the environmental impact if we build this project? And that's whether it's housing, I work in the energy field, I work in the transportation field, it applies to all of those too. We're not asking the question, what's the environmental impact if we don't build it? And so that's just one thought. And then the other thought, I also used to work for the California State Association of Counties. There's 58 counties in California. Los Angeles has over 10 million residents. Alpine has 1,200. And so when we lay a blanket policy like this across all of those local governments, we're ignoring the fact that they have vastly different capabilities and capacities and willingness, political will, to follow those new rules. So I guess with that in mind, my question is that, is there or has anybody thought about creating a state fund to cover local impact fees for infill, transit-oriented development, all-electric, affordable housing, so that there's some incentive to do what we want to have done, and maybe even, I know the state budget right now is in terrible shape, but maybe you put some additional fee on the sprawl development to help pay for that.
Thoughts?
Sure. And I think I understand the question, so please tell me if I don't. But I think the notion that I actually kind of want to get back to an earlier point about whether this is deregulatory or regulatory. As we heard in the last panel, those of us in the room, Kip had mentioned that these general efforts are regulatory, in the same way that I think you're kind of implying that we're establishing one regulation, applying it to jurisdictions of various different sizes, and their ability to meet that regulation is kind of dependent on local context. Something that last part, I definitely agree with. We work in a world of imperfects. I think my boss loves to say, don't judge this project by the almighty, judge it by the alternative. And I think that's definitely something that CEQA could be doing much more, especially as it applies to infill projects. But I actually think the legislature thinks of many of the things that they do around housing not as deregulatory, but actually as regulatory. I think when they adopt these types of things like SB 35 or all these different housing streamlinings that I contribute to, they are regulating what they perceive as bad actions by local governments and establishing what a definition in their mind of what constitutes a good action. And so like whether or not it's deregulatory or regulatory, for my personal politics or your general attachment to national politics is generally important. For me, it's, do with that what you will, but I think it's important for advocates to know that the way the legislature thinks about this is actually more a regulatory framework. And so that's partially why I think the question falls on its face when local governments advocates pose that back to the legislature, because the legislature is actually not looking for failure, but they're looking for improvements, performance improvements from local governments that they know will be difficult to meet, but they expect them to do that nonetheless. And so that I think is partially why that question has been unsuccessful in stopping the passage of a lot of these laws. The other thing about this is that the way the legislature approaches questions around housing is increasingly urgent, and sometimes urgency produces actions that are imperfect. I think though that if we want to propose the version of all this that's perfect, we need to be much more forthright about ways that will actually solve the problems that they want to solve, that their constituents have. And I think that's, again, around how do we produce, especially in the current economic system that we have, housing for people? How do we increase the rate of production? And that ultimately has to be our central focus. I mean, that's kind of related to these overbearing standards, but I think what we should do is we should take a focus on the places where we want to build housing, create the standard based around those places, and then apply that everywhere, even in places like Tulare County where it wouldn't necessarily work. I also would point out that there are very few projects in places like Tulare County where this is a material problem. I can think of one SB 35 project in South Lake Tahoe, but it's quite rare that there's an SB 35 project in rural areas, for example. Mostly because, especially the labor requirements are written around urban labor markets to the extent that they're written around policy at all.
Now I want to respond to Louis. No, I guess the confusion. So why I say, or I think a lot of EJ groups will say that it feels like deregulation of the market because there are no, I guess, safeguards. Like what are the guardrails? So even when we look at say contaminated soil, someone will tell me, well, we're going to do a phase 1 and we're going to do a phase 2. And that's going to be good, and we're going to know what's going on. And then when you look into a phase 1 and a phase 2, you realize that those phase 1s and those phase 2s for looking at whether there's environmental contamination, they're done by the project proponent. And then there's no one who's actually then going back and looking to do any accountability. And when I'm at like me or anyone else who's been kind of looking at soil and redeveloping and remediation in that way, we start to realize that even the state doesn't really know, because the state will say, well, we work with the developer and they're signed up for a voluntary cleanup, and so we're just going to continue to follow it along. But it's never, for instance, like DTSC, it's never their intention to be like, we are going to follow this completely and do all the remediation. It's really just kind of paperwork and looking at that paperwork and who's paying for that. And also the response then becomes the banks won't give you a loan to develop if there's risk, but then we hear from other groups that that's not necessarily true, that there are sites that are being developed on contaminated soil. So I think that's like when I think about deregulation, like who's following that up? I mean, it's private property, it's getting developed, but then it may be impacting environmental justice communities if it isn't an environmental justice community. So I'm not speaking for the whole state in general. I'm just kind of, when I'm looking at development being done in these communities, like that kind of raises a red flag for me. Like not even the state is talking to one another. DTSC doesn't talk to HCD. HCD doesn't know what DTSC is doing. So I just wanted to put that out there. And I feel like going back to building units, and I can draw on like my experience as a UD attorney. It's just like, how are people going to pay for these units? That's one of the things I feel like you were talking about, like comparing to Texas, but our standard of living and all the things that are happening, even if you are getting a unit that is deeply affordable, like your life is kind of like very tenuous. You can't do X, Y, and Z. You're living paycheck to paycheck. And that's sort of the reality for a lot of tenants right now. And even folks who are, I guess, like mission-driven affordable housing developers, if they are also owning that property, they don't necessarily have, there's no fail-safe. Like there is no like actual, everyone has a right to housing. So we're building units, but we're not necessarily thinking about who can stay in those units, or are we saying that everyone just has to continue to work to pay for those units, to pay for the rent like forever, and no one has any sort of leeway? And I feel like that kind of is the untenable situation for a lot of low-income communities of color, for a lot of EJ communities, that I think when we talk to our members about housing, that's what comes up. They're just like, you know, that's great, you want to build housing, but who can afford that? Like my overcrowded unit right now, none of us can actually apply for that and get into the units. So, I mean, that's just like on the ground truthing level of that, like what I see is sort of the frustration.
Sorry, I just wanted to add, I was working with the local government on a senior ag worker, farm worker housing, and I was like, do you mean senior or do you mean farm worker? I assume that at a certain point you're not going to be both, and they were like, oh no, like it is both. But I just wanted to raise something which I think has to come up at all of these panels at some point, which is all of these bills are designed to use the private market to create the housing. And we are missing a tool in California which is fully, or it's very limited. We have a very limited tool to do fully publicly funded affordable housing because of our constitution. So I just wanted to add that in because I feel like sometimes all of these housing laws seem like a Rube Goldberg contraption to like, why are we doing it in this very complicated way? Why can't we just build? If the state wants to spend money on affordable housing, why can't we just build it? And why are we instead spending all these resources doing all these planning documents and these other ways in order to achieve it? But just wanted to put that out there. I don't know if you had any.
So I wanted to follow up with a topic I know you probably have some thoughts on, Jennifer, and that is CEQA is focused on avoiding and mitigating, we hear it over and over again, physical impacts on the environment. But local debates over proposed housing often focus on issues such as displacement, gentrification, environmental justice, or perceptions about changing neighborhood character. Are these environmental impacts? Where and how can those types of concerns be expressed and addressed if they don't belong in CEQA reviews? Because there is no real checklist question under the initial study checklist that really captures some of those issues. And in fact, you have part of the statute that expressly sort of disavows socioeconomic impacts unless you can show a connection to a physical environmental impact. So what role should housing developers, legislators, agency planners, community advocates play in getting those concerns heard, and where and how should they be addressed if not in CEQA, or should they be addressed in CEQA and how?
I thought in the guidelines there is displacement. Like there's a checkbox for
Well, yes, in population housing there is would it displace, but I think it's framed in terms of substantial numbers of people.
I mean, I think also where I do think environmental justice communities have gone and kind of like when we talk about CEQA, like it does change. It hasn't been a static thing. I think when we talk about cumulative impacts, I think you can bring up a lot of environmental justice concerns in that like realm. I also know I'd also kind of defer to other practitioners. I know there are a bunch in this room, and also Winter, like where you see displacement, but I would say that it still fits in there, like for a community and in the environment and how we understand the environment.
Yeah, I think we've been talking about how the recent not so recent anymore, Supreme Court case saying CEQA doesn't deal with the environment's impacts on the project, and so I think people can get creative, and there has been follow-up. Well, if the project's going to exacerbate impacts, or the physically divide the community, or displacement does in fact have physical impacts, right? Like human beings are being displaced. But I think it sort of highlights a point that CEQA's been doing a lot of, from my opinion, good work in areas where that kind of go beyond maybe what we think of as being it's like the bread and butter of what CEQA, should be about. And this was, one of the points of like, if we're stripping CEQA back, we say, oh no, it shouldn't be about that. Well, then where's the additional protection, right? Like, I think people would feel a lot more comfortable if that bill was coupled with, and we're going to have this new law that actually addresses these impacts, right? And instead, it's sort of been the sole tool that we've had at our disposal. So I think people can get creative with it, but I think the world would be better if we had an actual, legislation that addressed these more head-on and actually provided the protection.
So along that vein, if each of you were benevolent dictator for the day, what policies or laws would you amend or adopt to address what you perceive as roadblocks to either housing production or environmental protection?
I think so hard to imagine what all I would do, but I think, so I've brought it up now so many times. So, for many years I have focused on housing element advocacy, and the real kind of surprise or assurance that people have is like, and for some jurisdictions the assurance they have is like, oh, we don't actually need to produce this housing, right? We just need to plan for it. So my focus probably as a benevolent dictator would be to have production requirements, and those production requirements would be tied to, a loss of transportation or other valuable dollars that, and that is difficult. Not every jurisdiction sees the same funding sources or the same situation, has the same incentives for doing production, but that would be probably my goal.
And then mine actually is not related to the environmental impact so much as that pesky racist constitutional provision and getting that repealed so that we could address this issue more directly with state funding.
I saw it and I was like, oh, I don't want to be a dictator of any kind. So I feel like we'd set up a lot of different processes. No, I think if there was something that I know that actually that we, like CBA has been working on, and also in conjunction with like CEQA Works and with CEHA, is actually having a stronger CEQA. And I do think that also includes the public participation process. Like if you have a good CEQA process, you get community buy-in, then you're gonna get good projects. And I think that's like the whole, being able to have those conversations that are difficult. It is so important for environmental justice groups, like if we were to think about the Jimenez principles, and one of those principles being really, communities speak for themselves, is how do you get communities to actually do community-led planning, and how does that lead to like deep democracy, and how necessary that is right now? Because I feel like a lot of the policies that we have now, it goes over the heads of a lot of community members who have not had any resources or have not had any buy-in. And I see that, even like for CEQA, like, yes, we have a public process, but there are lots of folks who, even if they, can speak English, they might not even have the ability to read. So like, we're not even looking at all the different things that are kind of challenges to also participate. So I feel like CEQA is like a template for that, and I do think that there's things that could be strengthened in that that does get more community process.
I'm surprised you didn't mention that the provision that you mentioned in our Constitution is up for repeal in November. We don't have a prop number, but I'm very proud to have been one of the lobbyists who helped get that to the ballot in November. Look it up, Article 34 repeal, definitely vote to repeal it. If I were a dictator, though, and I think most people would agree I'd be not benevolent, is that I would model our land use system much more closely to that of Japan's. In Japan, their Congress, the Diet, sets most of the rules around housing, what's allowed, the process by which it's evaluated, the codes that are used to instruct what's safe and what not. what's not, and then defers enforcement of those codes to local and regional governments. Japan, while it is a declining population as a country, has urban centers that are rapidly increasing in population, actually, that are much, much more affordable than similar population or housing markets in the United States and around the world. In fact, in Tokyo and some of the most in-demand markets in the country, you can find an apartment that is admittedly small for about $900 to $1,200 in job markets that you can return the similar wages to working in San Francisco. It's an incredible success. Adjusted for inflation, the average home in Japan goes down on an annual basis and has for about 10 years. Just the same way that old cars here in this country go down in value because we produce a lot of cars. If I could, I would model this system much more closely to a federal or nationalized system rather than a hyper-local system where communities like Belvedere get to veto whether or not more people, including their own children, get to live in their community.
All right, thank you. I'll just throw in, as a CEQA litigator, I'm all for making CEQA more complicated because it pays my mortgage.
You'll only be a dictator on the first day, though, right?
Right, only first day. Then
I'll be
democracy all the
violently
time.
cooed, I think, right?
Okay, so we'll turn it over to questions now. Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to follow up on the Belvedere example. I'm not trying to defend them. I know that community, and you're absolutely right. It's a very, very wealthy community, very small in Marin County. But I would like to say, since that's going to possibly be framed, that the original project was for 40, or 39, or 40. And then the developer said, well, we're going to use the density bonus and we're going to go up to 70 because the council was debating if they were going to require a full EIR. When the council voted 4-0, or one was abstaining the other night, to not do an EIR, it's now coming back to 40. So there is leverage sometimes with these things that doesn't tell the whole story, and I just can't help but have to fill that in. I think a big problem with all this affordability is the way these formulas are done. Again, in Marin County, you have West Marin, you have Eastern Marin. The income level is ridiculous, and not everybody there is wealthy, but because there are so many individuals that are, when that average is done to establish those levels of income for the categories, low, very low, or whatever, there was this stigma about no one wants very low or low in their community, because you know what that means, right? But that means probably at that high income level, those are the salaries of the teachers and the public service workers and all the people that everybody says they want to make sure has housing. So those formulas, to me, don't make sense in terms of really accommodating the levels that we're getting required in these in the SB 35 requirements, 10% affordable. What is that? That is like market rate for many communities. So I think that has to be fixed in ways if it could be. I also think that our dear legislators have never been planning commissioners or building commissioners. I think they're doing legislation over here to meet their housing goals and to get this done, and I get all that. But the practicality of doing all these some of these infill things, I'll use an example on my own street. I don't live in Belvedere. An ADU was plopped down the other day by a crane between a 50s sort of apartment building and then an 1880s house, which is among a little row of cottages. They're not on the local register, but because this man had replaced, the owner of the apartment building had replaced his garage parking pad, he was able to put that ADU there and not have to follow the 4-foot setback. That sits at the start of the year, it's been totally waived. So when you look at that now, 4 feet is the minimum distance for an ADA requirement to be able to have access on a sidewalk or anything else. This is less than that. I don't know how the rain drip off from that roof is going to affect that foundation next door. None of this stuff is being considered. So regardless, we can't talk about aesthetics, we can't, I've been a planning commissioner, you might understand that. But I'm shocked that there's no nexus between what is being asked blanket, not based on population, on size, or anything else, all across. there's communities in California that I'm sure are dying for these new expansions to get housing done. But some of the other communities, and I'm committed to making the arena numbers, there has to be some more coming to the minds with some more balance. When you have AB 1633 and you're going to put all these restrictions or restraints on a small community that maybe only has one planner that gets sick and can't even review this project in 30 days, and then is going to have to pay this fine, is that really creating another unit of housing? I mean, that to me is bad faith. I would like to see how many projects are not getting done in the absence of 1633. I never hear those statistics. So I want housing, and I want it fair, but I don't want communities totally gutted financially because some of the other areas that could be doing more, show us the bad actors, but don't penalize everybody. And I really feel that's what's happening. And I'm so sorry, but I've been trying to hold myself back.
Yes, sir, back there.
Dick Shaw, former council member in Petaluma. Pre the removal of redevelopment, we were always ahead as a city of anybody in the county on low-income housing construction. Not just approvals, but construction. We worked in partnership with nonprofits and other developers to be able to do that. So we're getting all these mandates out of the legislature. I don't think Scott Wiener has ever been a planning commissioner or has ever built anything other than his reputation. But the housing crisis is being used as a hammer to take away local control, to take away local community building, to take away local neighborhood building, all without the whole series of mandates, but no money. And one of the things that I'd love to see is redevelopment 2.0. I know it's a third rail in California, but tough. We need a long-term financial structure to be able to issue long-term local bonds to be able to do this kind of work. This whole thing about, well, you have to build 10 or 20% affordable housing, however it's defined. That means if we need 1.5 or 2 million units of affordable housing, you're going to have to build 7.5 or 10 million units of housing in total for the state in an 8-year period. That is never going to happen, meaning this whole affordable tithe of 10 to 20% means that it's always going to be ineffective, and it's a perpetual shortage of affordable housing. So for wood frame housing, that's a lifespan of 100 years or more, if reasonably maintained. So theoretically, we're building cities, we're building community, and we have no idea what we're doing. And by cutting out the local community, and by cutting out CEQA, it means we're building disasters, or that'll come true over the next half century to a century, because we can't pay attention to the flood zoning, climate change, where transportation exists, the fact that on a small city like Petaluma, 65,000, we don't essentially have a local transportation system. So we have the rail coming through, and you can build by the rail, but then where do you go? How do you get to your job if you're not working along the rail line? So all of this stuff is a large hammer under the guise of housing crisis, but I don't see it as solution-oriented other than making it possible for housing as a commodity for the industry to make a lot of money for the next number of years and walk away from the disaster that's happening. Sorry for the political statement, but that's my experience.
No, I think that's actually a really good point. And one of the things that I was thinking of when I was preparing for the panel too, you know, we work with a lot of communities that are either having oil drilling or oil refineries. And we have a state that has pretty active seismic activity, and we think we don't know all of California, right? The state hasn't been a state until 1850. The city of Los Angeles was a city in 1781 or something, but we don't know the whole history of everything. We don't know when a big one happens because we haven't existed on this land for that long. We, you know, like, and I think those are things that Like, I mean, just thinking about Wilmington, like I read somewhere that the gas companies actually, or the oil drilling companies, know quite a bit of where things are having more seismic activities because they've had to do that to figure out where they can drill. But we don't know that information. And so when you take away those, especially in areas that have pretty crazy seismic activity like that has like 5 oil refineries, I don't know where that conversation will happen if we're just talking about infill. Because even in Wilmington, where those oil wells are, that's considered residential. So if you have like, depending on where you are, and we've been talking to LA City about that, I mean, this is like a huge oversight. Like, no one's really looking at that.